It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 76. Hello, everyone, and welcome to It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from 1870 to 1930, when it was almost real. And in this episode, I will be discussing the wrestler who solved the puzzle of the masked marvel in the 1915 International Wrestling Tournament. But first, I just wanted to give a couple quick updates on some things that I've been working on. The first one is, for years, I have been looking for the wrestling matches of the famous physical culturist Burner McFadden. His name is spelled B-E-R-N-A-R-R, capital M-A-C, capital F-A-D-D-E-N. However, that was not his actual name. His real name was Bernard McFadden with no M-A-C. When he was wrestling in St. Louis, he was wrestling under B.A. McFadden, the original spelling of his last name. Burner McFadden was a little bit of an odd guy, and he had some odd ideas. Some of his ideas on physical culture were cutting edge and solid, and some of his other ideas would probably fall in the category of bro science or things that aren't based on evidence. When he was in St. Louis until February of 1894, he was just Barney McFadden. He was a physical culturist, which is an early term for bodybuilder. He was a lightweight wrestler. He weighed 140 pounds, specializing in Greco-Roman wrestling. I've looked for him for probably 4 or 5 years with no luck whatsoever. And I was researching another St. Louis wrestling match when the author of that newspaper article started opining about some of the matches that he saw over the years. And he had covered professional wrestling in St. Louis for about 20 or 30 years. And one of the names he mentioned was B.A. McFadden. And because I was searching for Bernard McFadden, because I didn't think he was going by Burner McFadden yet, I had never found those matches. So now I found a treasure trove of McFadden's matches. Definitely be a topic on the podcast in the future, and will also probably be a blog post, or a few blog posts on the website. Don't think that will become a book project. And then, as I had said on the previous episode, I was fortunate enough to be a guest on the Geek History of Time podcast with Damian Harmony and Ed Blaylock, which I really enjoyed. And I had been talking to Damian about the matches between Joe Stecker and Ed Strangler Lewis in the 19 teams, which were really for the supremacy. Who was the best shooter and hooker at that time? Stecker was a little bit ahead in the beginning, and Lewis eventually surpasses him. Well, I had cast doubt on what I had read in Lou Thesz's book, which is they wrestled I didn't cast doubt on this. I knew they had wrestled 3 matches that were really dull, long, and boring, because I had already found one of them. I had been looking for the other 2, and Lou Thesz said that those 3 matches went for 11 hours, and I doubted that at first, but now I think that may be on the money, because I found a 5-hour match between the 2 of them in early 1916. So I will definitely have that as part of a blog post, and it'll be a future topic on one of the podcasts. I am going to do another book on Lewis and one more book on, well, not one more. I haven't really touched Joe Stecker too much other than the Divided Championship and a little bit in Double Crossing the Goldust Trio. Those will be future topics on the podcast. And I've got a new theory now based on what I've seen. I'm wondering now if they wrestled 3 draws that went 11 hours and then they finally had a fourth match where Lewis won. But my goal for this next year is to find the remaining 2 matches, or one match if it was just one, to know once and for all by finding the accounts of these wrestling matches, which were contests. Professional wrestling, had it not developed into a work, would never have become a popular spectator sport, because legitimate contests, unlike what a lot of people probably think, were most of the time pretty boring. It was amateur wrestling with some submission holds thrown in. But if you've ever watched a submission wrestling tournament, you have a lot of those matches decided on points. It can take a very long time to win with a submission, or in this case, pin your opponent as well. It could take a very long time to get them in position to be able to do either one of those things. So a lot of the contests were long and boring and inconclusive. Some of the matches that settled promotional wars in the 1920s chased fans off for several months until they got to see the work stuff again, and it was more exciting. And with Toots Mondt changed the style of wrestling in the 1920s, it really made it more popular because things sped up. I know you still hear the talk of the 15-minute headlocks. There were holds on the mat for a long time. My grandpa used to go to matches with his uncle in the 1920s at the St. Louis Coliseum. He said sometimes because they were coming from North St. Louis on the streetcar to the Coliseum, which I think was in downtown St. Louis, they would not have a chance to eat. So they would come, they would watch the early matches because those were shorter. And then when the guys would get in a position in the main event on the mat, Uncle Jules would tell my grandpa, okay, come on, let's go get our sandwich now. And they would run across the street to the sandwich shop, grab a sandwich, and eat it, and then come back. And Grandpa said the 2 wrestlers would be in the same position as when they had left. He couldn't believe the difference in professional wrestling when I had become a fan in the 80s compared to what he was seeing in the 1920s. But Mondt and the Goldust Trio started to change that in 23, 24, 25. By the time I was watching in the very late 70s, 1979, and early 80s, the 20-minute headlock matches were a thing of the past. You still saw them in the 50s, but they were working them, they were moving. They weren't just laying on the mat for an hour, but you could have that in the teens and early 20s. The further you get away from it being a legitimate contest, the more wide open professional wrestling becomes. And in the review today, we're going to review a match between Fritz von Erich and Whipper Billy Watson from 1975 in Buffalo, New York. And that was a pretty wild match and probably was not something that wrestlers in the 19-teens or 1920s could have ever envisioned. I'm not sure that there was a hold in that entire... The match went probably 12 minutes because you had the introductions and everything beforehand. And then you had a post-match fracas as well. And the whole clip on YouTube is 17 minutes. So my guess is actual match time was 12 minutes. And I don't know if we saw a hold other than maybe a half headlock. But the topic I had chosen for today, because I've been talking about Ed Strangler Lewis quite a bit. Ed Strangler Lewis, when he went to Kentucky in 1913, I'm doing this fresh off the top of my head, so you'll forgive me if I'm off by a year. He basically spent 2 to 3 years in Kentucky, to the point where they were advertising him as a graduate of, I think, Kentucky State, whatever university it was based in Lexington at that time, because he did spend a short time as their wrestling coach. They would bill him as a college graduate from one of the Kentucky universities, and they billed him as a Kentuckian sometimes because he had spent so much time there, but obviously Anybody that's done any studying of Ed Strangler Lewis knows. He was born Robert Julius Herman Friedrich in Nakusa, Wisconsin. And in his early career, he wrestled as Robert Friedrich. He comes to Kentucky, and there's sort of a little circuit there that Jerry M. Walls is running. He wrestles regularly in Lexington, Louisville, and then a few spot shows here and there. And Jerry M. Walls also is his manager for like his first year, year and a half there. There is a book that Jim Cornette has referenced several times called Bluegrass Brawlers. Kentucky is a bluegrass state. I have not had a chance to read that yet. It's on my list of books to read. In that book, the author said that the reason he took the name of Ed Strangler Lewis in homage to Evan Strangler Lewis is he was booked in Kentucky but couldn't get there in time from Wisconsin, so they substituted another wrestler in his place so he could not then wrestle as Robert Friedrich. I was not able to verify that with my research, but the historian is someone that I trust. I'm almost positive it was Scott Teal. So I don't doubt that happened. I had thought that he had changed his name in homage to Evan Strangler Lewis because Robert Turtle Fredericks was also wrestling in Kentucky at the same time. And the Kentucky promoters a lot of time wouldn't want a Robert Friedrich and a Bob Fredericks wrestling there at the same time because it would confuse the fans. That's why I thought he had changed his name. But I trust Scott Teal's research. It probably was he was booked and he couldn't get there in time and they needed to change his name. Whatever the circumstances, he becomes Ed Strangler Lewis, which is an homage to another Wisconsin wrestler, Hooker, in the 19th century, one of the meanest wrestlers who ever put on a pair of tights. He was the first person to hold the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship that really established that as a clear, distinct title. Evan Lewis is the one that did that. Robert Julius Herman Friedrich, or Robert Herman Julius Friedrich, whichever one of the middle names I've got transposed, became Ed Strangler Lewis for the remainder of his career, and he would always be Ed Strangler Lewis in wrestling. By the 1915 International Tournament, he has developed a national reputation. He gains a name in Kentucky. He wrestles several nationally known wrestlers like Dr. Benjamin Roller and William Demetrol. He starts moving outside of Kentucky in 1914. Kentucky's still like his base, but he's moving outside of that. And then he starts wrestling all over the South in 1915. The 1915 International Tournament in New York was promoted originally by Sam Rockman, and then Rockman took on Jack Curley as his partner during the fall version. So the 1915 International Wrestling Tournament was actually two tournaments that occurred in 1915. The first one was the spring tournament, and it was highly successful. The Manhattan Opera House, where it was staged, the tournament routinely drew 6,000 fans, which was the capacity for the Manhattan Opera House. And it drew that throughout the tournament. And while wrestling was starting to be almost exclusively worked around this time, now 1915 is not a hard date. There are still contests after 1915, but they're becoming much fewer and far between. By the 1920s, the only contests you have are agreed upon contests, mostly to settle promotional wars, or double crosses. But if you look at the development of professional wrestling as a whole in the United States, from 1870 to 1900, more of the wrestling matches are contests than are works. But there are works going back to the 1870s. I don't want anybody to lose track or lose focus on that. There was never a golden age of professional wrestling in America where it was all shoots, ever. And unfortunately, a lot of the works, particularly the earlier ones, were around gambling schemes. From 1900 to 1915, you have a transition period. And originally, I thought it was probably half and half. Now I would say there were probably more works than contests, more works than shoots between 1900 and 1915. And then after 1915, it's what I had said before. There were a few contests. Most were to settle promotional wars and the occasional double cross. But Lewis is a serious, legitimate wrestler. And while the spring tournament was a great success, the fall tournament did not draw the same fan interest or the same fans to the Manhattan Opera House. And there were a couple reasons for that. The first reason, and the most important one, was the championship match, which was held in early June of 1915 between Alexander Alex Aberg, who was the person who ended up winning the fall, both the spring and the fall versions of the tournament. And Rockman was holding this tournament to try to replace Frank Gotch with Alexander Aberg. The problem was Aberg was a Greco-Roman wrestling specialist and did not want to wrestle catch wrestling. Catch as catch can wrestling. So Aberg only wrestled Greco-Roman wrestling matches. And this original tournament in the spring was only Greco-Roman wrestling matches, which had been sort of a niche style since the mid of the 1890s. Catch as catch can wrestling becomes the dominant form of professional wrestling in the mid 1890s. And from that point on, any other style of wrestling, and there had been dozens, is sort of a novelty. So this tournament had a novelty aspect to it, and that could have also been what attracted the fans to the matches for the spring tournament. And the tournament was considered all contests, which they weren't, but there were only 3 or 4 work matches in the spring tournament. They were actual contests. And Aberg wrestled Vladek Zbyszko. Now, Aberg had come to the United States in 1914 hoping to wrestle Frank Gotch, but Frank Gotch had retired in April of 1913 after beating Aberg's mentor and training partner, George Lurick. George Lurick would wrestle during the international tournament as well, and he worked a match with, at least one with Aberg, because those guys weren't shooting with each other. But Aberg ends up in the final match with Vladek Zbyszko, who is also a skilled Greco-Roman wrestler from Europe. He would transition into catch-as-catch-can wrestling. He and Stanislaus both spent considerable time training in catch wrestling, although they would always be more shooters or legitimate skilled wrestlers, but not necessarily submission wrestlers throughout their career. The match went almost 4 hours, and the newspaper coverage of it was one paragraph because it was just almost 4 hours of Zbyszko and Aberg wrapped in an upper body hold for the entire time. So the tournament ends with a draw for the title match. Sam Rockman says, I'm going to rebook this in the fall, but fan interest really took a hit from that inconclusive, long, boring match to end the tournament. They start the tournament back up in October. Aberg defeats Zbyszko this time after an hour, maybe almost 2 hours, but he defeats him for the spring tournament championship, and he is now the World Greco-Roman Wrestling Heavyweight Champion. But the fans are not accepting him as the world champion because Joe Stecker, who Gotch had agreed to wrestle, and they were going to wrestle a work to put Stecker over and make him Gotch's successor, had won the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in the summer of 1915 between the spring and fall tournament. And unfortunately for Aberg, I call him Aberg, I always have, but I've also heard it pronounced Aberg. But Alexander Aberg wins that Greco-Roman championship, but the fans recognize the World Heavyweight Champion as being Joe Stecker, who won the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship that summer in catch wrestling. Stecker is now considered the world champion. They start the fall tournament, and the fans are not coming out at all. Well, Rockman had taken on a partner for the fall tournament in Jack Curley, the longtime New York professional wrestling promoter, and they start trying to gimmick the tournament up to try to save it. So the first thing they do is they start doing a combination of Greco-Roman wrestling and catch-as-catch-can wrestling to try to bring the fans back in because they're used to catch-as-catch-can wrestling. You've got several good catch-as-catch-can wrestlers already in the tournament. Dr. Roller's there. He was wrestling Greco-Roman in the matches with Aberg because that would not change. Alexander Aberg would continue to wrestle only Greco-Roman wrestling matches. And he would continue to be undefeated in Greco-Roman wrestling. They start trying to bring people in. And one of the people that they bring in is a very young Ed Strangler Lewis. Lewis at this time is 24 years old, just developed this national reputation in Kentucky, and everybody knows he's an extremely skilled catch-as-catch-can wrestler. Lewis immediately challenges Aberg to a catch-as-catch-can wrestling match, which Aberg refuses because there's very little chance that Aberg would have been able to beat Lewis in his specialty. But Lewis does wrestle Aberg Greco-Roman, and Aberg wins that match. Will not wrestle Lewis in a catch wrestling match. Besides Lewis, the promoters also recruited another wrestler who they had start sitting ringside in December in the Manhattan Opera House, sit ringside in a mask, and it was the first masked wrestler in the history of American wrestling, at least that we've been able to find to this date, and that was the Masked Marvel. And the Masked Marvel gimmick was probably thought up by Jack Curley, but the Marvel, the Great Unknown as they were calling him, sits ringside and is challenging all the wrestlers. And the promoters absolutely refused to let him in the tournament, which helps the Marvel convince the fans that he's this great wrestler that the promoters have purposely frozen out of the tournament so he can't beat everybody and take the title. This actually works. Fans start coming out. Not only do fans start coming out, but all of the newspapers in the United States start to cover this story. So you read about the exploits of the Masked Marvel in St. Louis, in Kansas City, in Tulsa, Omaha, Minneapolis, St. Paul. Places outside of New York City that normally don't report on their sporting events are now carrying coverage of the wrestling tournament because of the Masked Marvel. And the Masked Marvel comes in and starts beating everybody. And if you want to hear about the person who played the Masked Marvel and the exposure of the Masked Marvel, you can go back and listen to episode 41. In that episode, I discuss, and it was the New Year's episode, from last year, New Year's 2024 episode. But if you go back to episode 41, you'll find out who played the Masked Marvel, what led to all of that, and what led to the exposure. But fans start really reacting to him, and the Masked Marvel's beating everybody. And he takes Alexander Aberg to a draw in the Greco-Roman wrestling match, which nobody had done. Well, towards the end of December, a couple of reporters who normally cover wrestling figure out who the Masked Marvel is. And a couple of newspapers report who they think the Masked Marvel might be. And this causes a problem because now wrestling fans are hearing about this, who the Masked Marvel may be, which was a journeyman wrestler who's not even a full-time wrestler. He's a part-time wrestler, full-time railroad detective. And it defies explanation of how he is all of a sudden beating these world-class wrestlers, particularly holding Alexander Aberg to a draw. So the promoters are like, okay, this is being exposed. What are we going to do? And while they're trying to figure out what to do, they book the Marvel into a match with Ed Strangler Lewis in Catch as Catch Can Wrestling. And I don't think that this was a contest, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. Maybe Ed Lewis went out and did what Ed Lewis was want to do sometimes and just told him, let's wrestle, which means we're going to have a contest. But whatever the circumstances, Ed Strangler Lewis is the first person that solves the conundrum of the Masked Marvel, how to defeat him. And this match takes place in the Manhattan Opera House on December 20th, 1915. And the only reason I think that it could possibly have been a contest is because Lewis ate him up. The Marvel hardly got any offense in at all. And Lewis took him to the mat, worked him over, and then eventually turned him with a hammerlock at 11 minutes and 30 seconds. Now, this is a guy that before had not been beaten by anybody and just got ate up by Lewis. The promoters normally would not do that. And maybe this, plus the potential exposure in the newspaper, was what convinced them that, well, this is blown, because the Marvel doesn't win another match after this. He does have a draw, and it might have been with Vladek Zabisco. Easy for me to say. With Vladek Zabisco. It might have been that they were having second thoughts and maybe we can save this thing. But Alexander Aberg was not going to be embarrassed by... He had already taken this guy to a draw. One of the few people he had not beaten flat out in the tournament. In the first tournament in the spring, he wrestled one or two draws with name people, but then beat him in the finish match. So, like I said, there were a couple work matches in the spring tournament, just a couple. But Aberg gets back in the ring with him a week later, and the papers have all reported who the Masked Marvel is. And Aberg ate him up and beat him and embarrassed him. The problem was the fans turned on Aberg because of that. They started booing him. They still liked the Masked Marvel even though they knew who he was. And they did not like the fact that Aberg just chewed him up. They accepted it when Lewis did it because it was in Lewis's specialty of Catch as Catch Can Wrestling. Lewis wrestled Vladek Zabisco later on that week in Catch Wrestling and defeated him as well. They could have been working. They worked together before. They also had a lot of punch-ups during their work matches. So Lewis and Vladek Zabisco have the catch match, and Lewis wins that too. Lewis does not win the tournament. He lost the only match that he had in the fall version of the tournament when he wrestled Aberg in Greco-Roman wrestling, and Aberg beat him like he beat everybody else in Greco-Roman wrestling. So in many ways, the Masked Marvel gimmick was a failure because the whole reason for both the spring and the fall tournament was to put Alexander Aberg over and have people look at him as the successor to Frank Gotch as the World Heavyweight Wrestling Champion. And instead, They made a big star out of the Mass Marvel, but also exposed their business in doing so, and then made their guy they wanted to replace, Gotch, a heel to the American people because one, he's from Estonia. At that point in time, it was part of the Russian Empire, but he was from Estonia. And a lot of time, unfortunately, in American history, the American wrestling fans accept the most abysmal, crass behavior from our homegrown wrestlers, but take a hostile attitude to wrestlers who come from other parts of the world. Not always the case, because with Sorikichi Matsuda, which if you look in the newspapers back then, it'll be Matsada, but it was what they had done. His real name was Kojiro Matsuda, and he was a sumo wrestler before he was a pro wrestler in America under the name of Torikichi. So they kind of blended the names together but misspelled them, and he became Sorikichi Matsada in the United States. If most scholars today write about him, they call him Sorikichi Matsuda because they know what his actual last name is. But I digress. The fans turn on Aberg. He wrestles here for about another year, and then he and George Lurich return to Russia. Oh, and speaking of the Georges, I had recently changed the back cover of my book because someone had pointed out that I didn't know how to spell George Hackenschmidt. And I misspelled it inside the book when I wrote it years ago because I did not realize both George Hackenschmidt and George Lurich, and I've also heard it pronounced Georg, their names were spelled Georg. Some of the American newspapers made it George with the E on the end, but actually the way they spelled their last name, there's no E on it. It's Georg. Well, I changed it on the back cover of the book until I get a chance to revise the whole book, and once I get their names spelt correctly, then it'll go back on the back cover as the same, because that's actually the way the Hackenschmidt and Lurich spelled their first name. Ed Strangler Lewis continues to become a bigger star. Funny enough, the wrestler playing the Mass Marvel would use that gimmick for another year and made good money with it, and then decided he was going to go back to being full-time railroad detective, part-time wrestler, and he sold the gimmick to other wrestlers who would go on and use that gimmick in the the late teens, early 20s. And of course, as we know, Ed Strangler Lewis became one of the most famous wrestlers of the 1920s and even going into the 1930s. And he wrestled his last legitimate contest with Lee Wyckoff in 1936 when he would have been 45 years old. Amazing, amazing wrestler was Ed Strangler Lewis. So he is also the one that solved the Mass Marvel in the 1915 International Wrestling Tournament. So if that's a question in your Gordon Soley trivia game, you've got the answer. The first wrestler to beat the Mass Marvel in the 1915 New York International Tournament was Ed Strangler Lewis, followed quickly behind by Alexander Alex Aberg. I recently watched The Iron Claw, and we're going to review that movie as soon as I can get Caleb to watch it. The great news is I was talking to my daughter-in-law when they were here with my grandsons the other day, and she really wants to see that. Her dad was a wrestling fan in the 80s and 90s, and he has shown her videos and that of the Von Erichs, and she really wanted to see the movie The Iron Claw based on that. So now that she wants to see it, I've got a good chance that I can get him to sit down and finally watch it. And then we'll review it. I'll let Caleb talk about his thoughts on it first, and then I'll kind of talk about where the film, because the timeline in that film is all screwed up. We'll talk about that, and I'll tell him some of the things that were left out, but that are very key to the story. Keeping in mind that we're going to do that review, I decided to go back and see what I could find on Fritz von Erich. And fortunately, there's quite a few videos on Fritz from the 50s and the 60s. So Fritz von Erich's real name is Jack Adkisson. He was born in 1929. He was a college football player and track star. And once he got out of college, he went back to Dallas for a while. And I think that's where he started his pro wrestling career. And he was just Jack Adkisson in Dallas. But he found his way up into the Northeast in the Buffalo, Toronto, New York area in the late 50s, early 60s. And that is where he became Fritz von Erich. And not only did he become Fritz von Erich up there, but at some point in time, and I think it was the early 60s, he started tag teaming with his kayfabe brother Waldo, who was actually a Canadian. So, and only in the world of professional wrestling can you have a Texan and a Canadian become kayfabe brothers of German descent, known as Waldo and Fritz von Erich. But Fritz von Erich really found himself as a professional wrestler up in the Northeast, where he became one of the most hated heels in professional wrestling. And the match that I decided to review was Fritz von Erich versus Whipper Billy Watson, huge star in the Toronto area, and a former NWA World Heavyweight Wrestling Champion. He's one of the few people that beat Lou Thesz for the title when Thesz needed to take a break because of an injury. And if you know anything about Lou Thesz, who's from my home city of St. Louis, Missouri, a fun fact, when he was in high school, and he was born the same year that my grandmother was born, he dated one of my great aunts. My grandma was one of 14. And one of her sisters dated Lou Thesz for a short time in high school. Grandpa always used to tell me, if your aunt had played her cards right, he said, you could have been related to the World Heavyweight Wrestling Champion. But Lou Thesz, who was from St. Louis, was very particular about who he dropped the title to. And he dropped the title to Whipper Billy Watson. So that shows you how much respect he had for Watson. In this match, Watson is definitely the babyface. Fritz von Erich is definitely the heel. And it's a match from Buffalo in 1957 that was refereed by the former World Heavyweight Boxing Champion, Rocky Marciano. Before Marciano, Jack Dempsey had been a special guest referee in a lot of matches. And then, before his tragic early death in a plane crash in 1969, Marciano was also a referee several times. In this match, Marciano was definitely going to have his hands full because, as I said, it went about 12 minutes and you don't see much actual wrestling at all. So the commentator for the match was a old-time wrestler by the name of Lord Ethel Layton. He would also be the commentator for big-time wrestling in Detroit, the Toronto area for a long time. And he gets into a little tete-a-tete with Fritz von Erich outside the ring. But when they start the match, they do the introductions. They introduce Whipper Billy Watson first. Then they introduce Fritz von Erich. And I will say at least they had the good taste, even though he was supposed to be some kind of Nazi German character. At least they didn't have the swastikas on the back of the cape. They had the Iron Cross on the back of von Erich's cape. And then Rocky Marciano, of course, starts the match. And you know that he's going to be involved in this somehow as the referee. Well, this match is pretty much just a kind of punch, mostly brawl. They start off and they do the typical tie-up and they're rolling around the ropes trying for a position. And Marciano is having to constantly pry these guys off of each other because they're constantly trying to tie up and he'd hit each other on the brakes and grab each other and headlock and hit each other. And Von Erich is doing most of the cheating. But a couple of minutes in, maybe 2 to 3 minutes into the match, Watson spins Von Erich to the ropes, pulls off and hits him with a forearm, and then grabs his head almost like in a Muay Thai. It wasn't a flying mare or anything. It was like a Muay Thai clinch that you see at MMA, and spins around and throws Von Erich head first between the second and third ropes. Von Erich, of course, lands on his feet, but he almost hits the table as he's going down where Lord Atherlayton is sitting. And he lands right by a fan, and I guess the fan said something to him or tried to touch him, and Fritz Von Erich just palms the guy's head and shoves him. And Lord Atherlayton's like, hey, he just assaulted a fan. And the Buffalo police are right there immediately to stop anything from getting out of hand. And as Fritz Von Erich's walking back to the ring, he shoves Lord Atherlayton at the table as well. And Lord Atherlayton is still a active wrestler, so he has to explain, oh, he caught me off guard there that time. I'll have to watch for him. He's got animosity towards me for things we've done in the ring previously. Fritz gets back in there. They have another brawl. Go maybe 4 more minutes. And it's a combination of Whipper Billy Watson pushing him in the corner and Marciano grabbing him and prying him off. Or grabbing Fritz. Fritz keeps grabbing the headlock and punching Whipper Billy Watson in the face. And Marciano is constantly having to drag Fritz off and shoving him. And Fritz acts like he's going to take a swing at Rocky Marciano, which, of course, Rocky Marciano is like, okay, puts his hands up. As soon as he puts his hands up, Fritz, typical heel move, dives out of the ring. And then he comes back in, and Whipper Billy Watson gets him and does that same Muay Thai clinch throw out of the ropes again. This time he almost lands right on top of the announce table. Well, by this time, Gene Kiniski, who was his partner, so I'm guessing that Fritz and Waldo are not a combination yet, because Fritz and Gene Kiniski were former tag team partners, and Big Thunder's trying to get Fritz motivated in that, and he stays out at ringside. And Marciano engages with him for a few minutes, but Fritz and Whipper Billy Watson go back into the ring at it. And this goes on for another 3 to 4 minutes. Well, Watson gets Fritz Von Erich in a position of danger where it looks like, oh, he may get him in a pin. And Gene Kiniski comes in the ring and hits Watson from behind. So Marciano immediately calls for the DQ. The Buffalo police start to file into the ring. And before they have a chance, Whipper Billy Watson tees off on Kiniski and rips his jacket off, rips his shirt off, before the Buffalo police finally, and after Watson does that, knocks Kiniski down, then Fritz tries to jump on him, and they both try to jump on him in the corner, but there must be 6 Buffalo police officers in there with either the promoter or their head of security, and they get Kiniski out of there first. And then Whipper Billy Watson tees off on Fritz again once he's only one-on-one. And Fritz is also now enraged, and he starts to make a move towards Watson, and Rocky Marciano kind of shoves him away. And finally, Fritz gets out of there once the Buffalo police came back. So I think that Fritz was kind of keeping everybody's attention on the ring and having Watson hit him a few times so the fans wouldn't think about coming into the ring. And he was just waiting for the Buffalo police to get out there so that they could walk him back to the back. The ringside area was dangerous for heels in the kayfabe era. St. Louis was not a place known for a lot of heat. Sam didn't like to generate a lot of heat. Sam Muchnick, the longtime St. Louis promoter. But I've seen people get so excited about a match who knew that what they were working was not a contest that it was something else, but they would get so worked up and forget themselves, they might take a swing at the heel. And the ones you really had to watch out for were the true believers who thought everything they were seeing in front of them was real, because it didn't take much for them to get caught up in it. I've seen people take swings at Bulldog Bob Brown, King Kong Bruiser Brody, Dick Murdoch. Fans just, and this is St. Louis, where they never, almost never had riots, never had any kind of fan commotion. There'd be fights with the fans sometimes between each other, but you almost never saw the fans take shots at the wrestlers. But in my time at Kiel Auditorium with my sister, I saw a couple of wrestlers that people tried to punch. Bulldog Bob Brown was the one who drew the most heat like that fans would forget themselves and try to hit him. But if you ever saw Bob Brown wrestle, you'd just want to hit him on general principle anyway. He had a face that said, "Punch me." So he was a great heel in that way, because he had most of the fans wanted to kill him. And that was one of the things that really hurt the promotion in St. Louis after Sam retired. Bulldog Bob Brown and Rufus R. Jones were the line. So those were the mid-card guys that the person who was going to challenge for the Missouri State Heavyweight Wrestling Championship or the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship the next time the world champ was in town, because the world champion was a traveling champion back then. If you were a heel and you beat Rufus R. Jones, you were going to get a shot at one of those titles. If you were the face or the baby face or the fan favorite and you beat Bulldog Bob Brown, you were going to get a shot at those titles. When Sam retired, Bob Geigel, because he was real close friends with both of them, tried to push them as low main eventers. I think he put the Missouri title on Bob Brown, if I'm not mistaken. And that was a terrible, terrible mistake, because the fans for 10 or 15 years had seen these wrestlers, and Rufus R. Jones was over, but they had seen these wrestlers as solid mid-card guys all those years. Now you're trying to push him as a main event wrestler, and the fans just weren't buying it. So we're getting close on about an hour, so I think that's enough for this week. Next week, I'm hoping will be the Hall of Fame episode with Dan. I think we're going to get some time over the next weekend or two where he and I can sit down and record an episode. I may share my thoughts on WWE and AEW in that episode when I talk to him, but the bulk of that episode is going to be who we think has been left out of the Hall of Fame and why they should be included in the Hall of Fame. And we'll probably catch up on some news items, as wrestling news items. We'll get caught up on that. And then hopefully the next week we'll do the Iron Claw. Maybe not. We'll see if my daughter-in-law was able to get Caleb to watch it by then. I know he wants to see it, but I have to be honest and say he is so busy. He manages a store. He has 2 children. And he's doing this as a favor for me. So I can't be too obnoxious with him about it. So as soon as we can drop that episode, we'll drop that episode. And I may get Trey on here sometime in the next few months just to talk about a contest. If there's a mixed styles match we've not reviewed from YouTube prior to MMA becoming a sport, those are the kinds of things that I like to have Trey on for. As a lifelong martial artist, he has unique thoughts and that about watching these legitimate contests between the wrestlers and the boxers, or the wrestlers and the karate people, and vice versa and all that. So until next time, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.